Kwekwe. Victoria Grant, Indigenous, Timiagma Anishinaabe Kwe. Mong Indoden, Lake Tamagmi, Induchinabayon. Thank you for this opportunity to share stories of community building in a time of truth and reconciliation with my two colleagues, Bruce and Elisa. We hope our stories will illustrate how a process of learning, unlearning, and relearning has helped us in building healthy relations and inclusive organizations. I would also like to acknowledge that we are on the land of our fellow Anishinaabe, whose communities are Curve Lake, Alderville, and Hiawatha. I grew up on Bear Island, Lake Tamagami, in a community when I was growing up was 90, now has tripled in size. So we're at almost 300. I could describe life the way many of us describe walking to school when we were young, that we walked uphill both ways. Winters were quiet, and summer brought in people from away, to cottages, to summer camps, and the lake was abuzz. One of my earliest memories is watching young people in canoes paddle by Bear Island and wondering where they might be going and what it might be like to be in one of those canoes. Those were the canoe camps on Lake Tamagami. From a young age, I have been volunteering in clubs, parent-teacher organizations, and recreation groups. It was my commitment to volunteering locally that led me to be invited to join the Ontario Trillium Foundation. It is where I was introduced to institutional philanthropy. It is where I learned about Community Foundations of Canada and what a community foundation was. So then the question became, why don't we start one in our community? Tamagami is a unique community made up of seasonal residents, full-time locals, and Timiagma Anishinaabe. At the time, due to a land claim, politics, and varying interest, there was much dissension in those different sectors of our community. It was then that Walter Ross, a seasonal summer resident, and I began to discuss the idea. While many often refer to Walter and I as the co-founders of the foundation, it would not have happened without the support of the many people in all the three sectors of our community. We saw it as a way to begin conversations and to build community together. The Tamagami Community Foundation was established in 2002. I will read you a poem that captures the essence of what the Tamagami Community Foundation was about. Tamagami, the lake, the town, the people. It is island and mainland, summer and winter. It is the confluence of forest, waters, and cultures. It is the magnificence of landscape and the conundrum of competing uses. The wealth of a richly varied population. Tamagami is a place of intensity and serenity, of native, resident, and visitor. The balance is elusive and integral. It is a community, and in its stewardship rests the honor of its heritage and promise of the future. One of the first initiatives of the Tamagami Community Foundation was an art camp for kids ages 6 to 16. It became our signature project. It was bringing youth and volunteers together from all sectors of our community. What began as a way to build bridges amongst children also helped adults learn and connect with one another. Now, 23 years later, the camp continues to connect our community. Starting with the Tamagami Community Foundation, I have been fortunate to serve as a director on many other foundations, including Community Foundations of Canada. It was here I met Bill Lockington, who at every board meeting had a story to tell about the Canadian Canoe Museum. I always thought of the canoe as one of the single most important artifacts in the making of Canada. I often in my work used it as a metaphor in building relationships in developing organizations. And when I was asked to join the board of the museum, it seemed a natural thing to do. I am coming to the end of my term with the Canadian Canoe Museum. And when I came on as a board member, it was thought that in my term as chair, I would be opening a new museum. As chance would have it, that did not happen. Instead, I had the opportunity to be the board chair, to pivot and be part of this incredible build. I had the opportunity to work with incredibly committed board members, our architects, Carol and Jeremy, and the staff at the museum. Much of it was done through the pandemic, which was a blessing and a curse. But look around. Isn't this building wonderful? I can't tell you how proud I am to have been part of this project. My favorite part of this building is standing on that platform between the two staircases and looking out at all the canoes on racks in the storage area. I never get tired of standing in front of that window. Being immersed in the space is a great feeling of wonder. What are those stories that those canoes are carrying? Before COVID, we bought children from Temagami for an overnight sleep amongst the canoes and a tour of the old museum. In a discussion as we were going through the Hudson Bay exhibit about the early explorers, I overheard one of the teachers remark, actually, those early explorers were on guided tours. How many of us have read stories about the early explorers and their stories about discovering new lands, when in most cases, the people the land that they were traveling with were the people who lived there. And without them, they wouldn't have been able to do that. Yet, we do not acknowledge. We have a shared history in this country, one that many in this country were not aware of until the Truth and Reconciliation Commission began its process, and the stories of residential school became public. For the first times, hearts and minds were connected to the truth of young children being removed from their homes without the consent of the parent. Every parent could relate to that. I have been fortunate in my life. I am not a planner, but as doors open, it is a choice whether I walk through. It is because of these opportunities that I've always been an advocate for more Indigenous people's engagement in my work and in my volunteer world. At another event some years ago during question period, someone asked, "That was great and informative. Have you thought about what you want us to do?" I didn't have an answer. Today, I hope at the end of our time together, we will leave you with a better understanding of our shared history and some of the work that we have been engaged in that relate to the Truth and Reconciliation agenda. Ideas on how you might participate in the reconciliation movement in this country, and the importance of volunteering to build a community, a country, where we all belong, especially in these trying times. And now I'm going to turn this over to Elisa to introduce herself.
Thanks, Victoria. Ani Bojo, Wabas Kes Muskadang Bishkiki. Can you hear me? I don't know if it's on. I think it is.
Good.
Ning Dodam, Neashing Naming Undonjaba. My name is Dr. Elisa Levi. You can't. So
Try this one.
maybe. We'll trade.
Oh, wait.
There
Yeah.
you go.
Da-da-da.
That one
No, you
works.
can.
Here.
I'll start again.
You have to put it close to you.
Hello, everyone. Thank you, Victoria. I have never been here, and this is such a beautiful place. When I walk through those doors, and not even knowing the history of the Canoe Museum, you could just feel the energy and the stories that are here. And even though it's canoes, there's a life in that. So as I was saying, my name is Dr. Elisa Levi. I'm from the Chippewas of Nawash unceded First Nation. I currently live in Owen Sound. And I asked myself as Vicky was speaking, even though we've talked about coming here this evening, about the why. Why am I here? And in hearing Victoria's story of her history and her commitment to volunteerism, I think back to about, goodness, that must have been 15 years ago, where Victoria showed up one day when I was at work in a role that she sat on as a member of the board of directors. And she showed up just to visit. And that, I think, just in an introduction, relations and knowing where you come from, as I described in my introduction, as Vicky described in her introduction, the places where you are, the places you're from, and the community in which you come is so important. And so just connecting back to these canoes here and the stories that they have and the journeys that they've traveled and where they are from is something that is, I think, all of us can relate to in some way. So just briefly, I do reside in Owen Sound, so I drove here today, and but I practice family medicine in my community of Neoshingnaming, which is Cape Croker on the Bruce Peninsula, if you know, north of Wyerton. And I didn't grow up in the community, but I think one of the things that was so important to me was to return to community and think about healthcare in a different way. So I think, as we talk tonight, I'm going to come with that perspective and just share a little bit more of that and connect back to Victoria's opening, and just share what that means in terms of the truth and reconciliation calls to action. So yes, thanks.
So my name's Bruce Lawson. Can you hear me? Is this on?
Yeah, now
Okay,
it's on.
great. So I sort of feel, as Vicky was talking, I thought, yeah, there are a few parallels to Vicky and me. So number one, I come from a community that has also tripled in size, known as Toronto. Um, Walter Ross is actually my father's first cousin. Um, and like Vicky, I've volunteered in a variety of contexts. And I paddled across Lake Temagami when I was going to summer camp. And had we in the it was a terrible day on Lake Temagami. I won't, and we stopped hoping that we could go at 5 o'clock in the morning. It was still terrible, but we made it. Hallelujah. But we did not stop at Vicky's Island. I've been to Vicky's Island since. So I am descended, I'll say, from fourth and fifth generation immigrants from the British Isles, so Scotland, England, Ireland. And my great great grandparents settled in the Pickering area and then moved into Toronto. Um, and it was my grandfather who actually created the Counseling Foundation of Canada, of which Vicky, I am the former CEO. I carry a lofty title called the Special Advisor, which means I just do projects. And I'm doing one specific project. Somebody else is running the foundation now, and Vicky is the chair. I recruited her to be chair, and then 5 minutes later, I was like, Vicky, I think it's time for me to go. Um, so, and the foundation was created back in the 1950s with an idea that my grandfather wanted career counseling listed as a discipline of applied psychology. He believed that young people should have access to good quality career counseling. If they did, it would help them make better career choices. They would be happier in their lives, and it would make the economy as a whole better because people would be using their natural skills and talents to their best purposes. And he actually funded the creation of the first career center at York University based in psychological counseling. And essentially, that became the model that is now pervasive across the country. And he funded the creation of most of the campuses, both colleges and universities, from Ontario to the East Coast, always with the proviso, if he built it, the organization would take it on. He died in 1984. Soon thereafter, probably about 1987, the board of the foundation, I was not on the board at that point. I was too young to be on the board, but the foundation got involved with a grant to Lakehead University. And I think a predecessor of mine, not my immediate predecessor, actually went up to Lakehead. It was for the Native Students Association on campus. She went up to the campus to sort of tell them all the reasons she wouldn't give them a grant, only to come back and tell the board that they had to give the grant because there was a cultural apartheid on campus. And so that became our first time in about 1987 when the foundation gave money, I'll say to an Indigenous benefiting organization, but it started to go from there. And then in the midst of Lehman Brothers collapsing, my immediate predecessor went on medical leave, and I was like, I have 2 days a week. I'll help run the foundation. And 15 years later, I stepped down. And along the way, one of the first projects that I really got involved in with the foundation was I met somebody from the McConnell Foundation in Montreal. We were talking. He said, did you ever do anything in the Indigenous sphere? And I said, only for 25 years. He's like, we don't know about you. Let's talk. And out of that came a program where we were trying to, working with an organization called Ashoka to do a online competition to surface promising and wise practices in Indigenous learning for First Nations, Métis, and Inuit, from early childhood through to workplace learning. And somewhere along the way, Victoria Grant arrived at the table. We were struggling. We didn't have any Indigenous people at the table. Then there were more Indigenous people, and Vicky ultimately took on a big leadership role in this process, and things clicked. We moved forward, and I can say from a foundation point of view, this was a real catalyst in the work that we did and how it changed my viewpoint. I will say, having grown up in Toronto, I didn't really give much thought to Indigenous people. I know we're going to talk about learning and unlearning and relearning, but Indigenous people were not really visible to me in those days. But very much so, as we got further into the work, became a priority in our work, and led us to a number of programs. Out of the program that I worked with Vicky, came the Circle on Philanthropy, of which Elisa became the first executive director. So that's sort of how all our paths weave together and how we've been in relation with one another for quite a while now.
Thank you, Bruce. I'm going to tell you, give you sort of a platform that these organizations all began from. In 2008, and I'm going to start with a quote from Justice Sinclair, because I think this is really important for all of us. He talked about a period of change is happening that if sustained by the will of the people, will forever realign the shared history of Indigenous and non-Indigenous people in Canada. In 2006, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission was formed. We were not sure what was to come from that, but it was starting to bring Indigenous issues to the forefront. It was the beginning of when you would see articles in the Globe and Mail. My husband, who reads the Globe and Mail every morning, would look at me and say, there's another article in the paper this morning. In 2008, there was little support from philanthropic organizations to Indigenous peoples and organizations. If I remember correctly, and Lisa, you can correct me if I'm wrong, I think it was 0.8% of the total philanthropic dollars that were going into Indigenous communities, with over 60% of those funds administered by non-Indigenous organizations for the benefit of Indigenous peoples. Those of us who were engaged in promoting support for Indigenous peoples during those years, we all came together and pulled a gathering together of invited philanthropic organizations who had never sat in a room with Indigenous people before, CEOs who'd never sat in a room. And we met in Winnipeg. And it just happened that it was the week that Stephen Harper made his apology. We left that gathering with a commitment that we would begin to work together. And we created a network called the Network for Aboriginal Grant Making. That was, and it wasn't going to be an organization at that time. And following that was this gathering that, so this network the next year met in 2009, and that was when we started to talk about the project that Bruce referred to. He'll probably tell you a little bit more about that. But out of that organization came the Circle on Philanthropy, and I'm going to leave that for Elisa to go more further on. All this led to more engagement with philanthropic organizations. But I think one of the most significant developments that I think made the most difference was 10 years ago in the creation of the Declaration of Action by the philanthropic communities, which came about as a challenge from Senator Sinclair. We'll talk a little bit more about that, but I'm going to let Elisa talk a little bit about how she got here and her role in the circle.
Thank you. You might wonder, I introduced myself as a family physician, which I do on the day-to-day, but Vicky's taking me back to a number of years ago, and I first studied after I went to university. I was a registered dietitian, and then went on to do a master's in public health, all for the purpose of working in Indigenous health, which I've worked in most of my career. Physician is my second career. So we're going back. There was a period where I was working at the Assembly of First Nations, and I think around that same time that the Truth and Reconciliation work was underway, National Chief Phil Fontaine at the time had released a corporate the Assembly of First Nations had released a corporate call to action, and that was to disclose that First Nations people were living at far a rate than Canadians, right? And then, so Canadians caring would respond, well, we should help. And there were a lot of charity-based models that were coming up when I was a policy analyst there. And it just really opened my eyes that that was the immediate response. So if there was an inequity, let's send something without consideration for, and maybe that's the way charity worked. So at that time, there were a lot of things happening. Like I think on that level, just seeing that action, and that's how charity actually worked. And there wasn't, I think it was less than 1% of the philanthropic sector would gift to Indigenous peoples, much like I would imagine that this building was gifted by the philanthropic community. So when the circle came to be, I remember reading, I think one of the first reports that came out just showcased that the inequity even in the sector. So I was the founding executive director of this new organization that was a network of the philanthropic community and granting organizations. But it was a different time than it is now. On the peripheral, not being much involved, I think in starting this organization and reaching out to foundations about, joining a membership-based organization, the appetite wasn't there. I think many of these foundations said, well, we don't do work in Indigenous communities, or we don't gift to Indigenous communities. And the whole reason for starting this type of organization around that time was because that whole charity-based model of not involving, and not for the work that Bruce mentioned that his organization was doing, but there wasn't many organizations that were meaningfully working with Indigenous communities. It was more like, this is what we can do for you, or this is our models and how you might fit our granting. But it was a different conversation then. Um, so, I think with anything, when there's an opportunity, something can happen with people around the table just working together to try to find a way forward. And that was how the circle was built, because of that. And then work that went um, on afterwards was just really connecting and sharing experiences and how to work with communities.
So I said that I had grown up not really hearing anything about Indigenous communities. When I took over the foundation in 2008, I was actually at a conference in early 2009 that we sponsored, and I was just starting to get out and meet some of our grant recipients. And one of them was on the West Coast. I think it was University of Victoria. They were doing a program for Indigenous students, master's students in psychology, and counseling. Um, and so I wanted to go, and I hadn't met them yet, and this was an opportunity. They had sort of come to the conference to present, and I thought this is a great opportunity. I'm gonna, I can go and meet with them here at the conference, and so I sit down at the session, and this was a big learning for me because somebody got up at the front and said, "Let's see who's in the room," and it was a 60-minute session, and so it went. The microphone was sort of passed around the room. And 45 minutes later, it got to me, and I still hadn't heard anything about the program, but people were saying, "This is where I'm from. This is my home community. My people had migrated from here to there." And I really sort of like, "Oh my God, I'm tense. I really want to hear." And everybody finally at the 55 mark of a 60-minute session, we got into the program and they said, "Well, we don't really have time, but thank you all for being here." Everybody except me walked out of there thinking that this was the greatest session ever. And I was like, it sort of dawned on me, one of these things is not like the other, and the one that is not like the other is me. And what was wrong with me that I didn't understand why this was a great session? But it was very much about who was in the room and who was going to be relational to one another, and it became an aha moment. So we're talking about learning, unlearning, relearning. This became a real aha moment for me that, oh, this is different. This is challenging my assumptions of who these people are, and how they are in relation to one another, and how they connect to one another, as opposed to what I'd call the very transactional way in which we, as sort of Westerners, as Canadians, typically enter into a relationship and build the relationship over time, as opposed to create a relationship and then do the work. We typically just, my background was always, let's do the work and we'll build the relationship along the way.
Mm-hmm.
This was very different to me. So a big learning moment for me. And then Vicky talked about Justice Sinclair. As I got more into this, I don't know if you were there, Vicky. This was after the circle was created. Elisa would have been running the circle, but a group of us went off to Edmonton to the TRC, one of the TRC events, one of the big gatherings in Edmonton. And you're sitting in the hall listening to survivor stories. You came away profoundly moved, profoundly shocked at what had been going on. And these were things that you couldn't unhear, what people had said and how their lives had been destroyed by residential schools, and how those effects had gone intergenerationally, how this played out generation after generation. And even for grandchildren of people who had gone to residential school who did not go to residential school themselves, they were still living the vicarious trauma of those familial bonds that had been broken. And so about a year later, Justice Sinclair came to a philanthropy conference and sort of put out a challenge to philanthropy to do something. Um, so a couple of colleagues and I got a call from one of my colleagues saying, let's write a declaration. I was like, sure, how hard can it be? Typical. Let's do it, sure. And Vicky came. We got Vicky. We recruited Vicky into it because we always wanted to have Vicky at the table, and a bunch of other people. And for about 4 months, we were trying to write this declaration. We had hired a consultant, an Indigenous consultant. Uh, we had hired an Indigenous communications consultant to write on behalf of philanthropy. Big mistake. So in what seemed like to my colleague Andrea and I, who were sort of leading the charge, we thought, are we going to be recolonizing these people if we say we need to take this away from you and we actually need to write it ourselves? But it was another big learning moment, and actually came out really well in the end. And then 3 weeks before the closing event of the TRC, we had a declaration. It's like, oh yeah, we better get some people to sign this. So about with 3 weeks to go, I think we had 30 organizations that had signed on to the declaration by the time we presented it at the closing event at the declaration at the TRC. I'm gonna.
And I guess what I would say, Bruce, is and a question I would ask, um, how do you think the Declaration changed the landscape?
So I
also
think.
want you to answer that question.
Do you want to start that?
Oh, you can.
So I'd say, first of all, it certainly changed the landscape of philanthropy in the way that the Circle philanthropic foundations there are a variety of associations in the philanthropic sphere, one for community foundations, one for private foundations. And it really accelerated the amount of Indigenous content, Indigenous speakers that came to conferences that were presenting. There were narratives that were being presented on stage regularly. It wasn't just a performative land acknowledgement. There were keynote speakers, there were panel sessions. We were very diligent about trying to incorporate that and use these platforms as education for those who had not yet signed on to the declaration. And in fact, Vicky and I were working on the 5th anniversary of the declaration in late 2019. We were trying to convene a group of us who had been at the table, and then all of a sudden COVID hits, and everybody's going home. And so the favorite word of the moment at that time, pivot. So we pivoted away from thinking about the declaration of action, and I noticed from our perspective, and it was from other foundations that I was talking to as well, we were getting calls from charities in Toronto, in Montreal, in Vancouver, in Calgary, charities that we knew and that knew us, but the people that we weren't hearing from were Indigenous communities. Despite the fact that we had built a number of relationships with some really strong relationships, Indigenous communities by and large did not know who we were, with the exception of the organizations we were already working with. And so it sort of occurred to me, I remember back, I don't remember if it was SARS or MERS, the federal government, in their infinite wisdom, sent body bags to Indigenous communities as their response. And I was like, this can't happen again. And so I started talking to some of my colleagues, and could we do something? Could we create a fund to support Indigenous peoples? And can we put Indigenous peoples in charge of who actually gets the money? They get to decide. They get to decide the criteria. Here is money. You deploy it into community because you know who needs the money, not us. And this was sort of one of those moments that we had done a lot of education. We had been doing a lot of work through the sector. By the moment we got to COVID and I started making calls, I got Vicky and another colleague, Wanda, involved. And they were sort of doing the background work, trying to put the Indigenous Peoples Resilience Fund together. I was calling some of my colleague foundations, and nobody had a question of why this would be necessary. Everybody at that point knew. And the moment you said it was like, oh yeah, yeah, we should do that. And so 10 weeks into the pandemic, I think we started with $1.5 million.
Actually, no, we were at 5 by then.
Okay,
10
we were at
weeks.
5 by then, 10 weeks into the pandemic. So a completely different narrative by the time, through the declaration of action and all of the work that had led up to that.
One of the things, go
Oh,
ahead.
go ahead.
You go ahead first.
Okay. I'm just thinking about, I mean, in the audience here, I don't know your backgrounds, but when I think of positioning this, we're talking about the philanthropic sector, and that's one sector, that holds an amount of funds that has not been accessible to Indigenous peoples, as we've already said. I think back to that 2019 part. You said it changed, right? Very different from when the circle was founded and trying to get members on board. And many people, I'd call random foundations and they'd say, no, we're not doing work in this space. So that's a quick change. Around that time where the foundations were mobilizing to start a new organization or fund a new organization that would be led by Indigenous peoples, I do recall the government releasing funds because people did not have access to food, something that Indigenous people have experienced in Canada, higher rates of food insecurity. And they gave funds to 5 major charity organizations that would then gift to Indigenous peoples. Still not at the part where foundations were changing kind of their ways. And we see that as something not connected. So sometimes the story evolves, but then one steps back, and I think there is an opportunity for funding innovation led by Indigenous peoples through both of government and the philanthropic sector. That just came to mind as you were speaking as something, because I remember calling Victoria at that time and saying, hey, look, this doesn't make sense, that now charities have money to give to Indigenous peoples, but they're not doing work. They don't, and it becomes kind of the mistakes replicated. So we're not unlearning, but almost making new mistakes.
One of the things too, it was, what was that Canada Food, because they were into food security, and we got a call from them at IPRF, at the Indigenous Peoples Resilience Fund, and they said, we want to give you some money, but we don't know how to do that. And it was interesting, because we kind of had to go around in a circle and say, well, we have these communities, and the reason was the IPRF money, the money that came into the Indigenous Peoples Resilience Fund was unencumbered, totally unencumbered. So the foundations who supported the IPRF at the beginning gave us unencumbered money, except for sometimes a regional. So we had to show them that we had put grants into a specific area. But that was easy, because we had no trouble finding areas for them that we could give money to. But in this case, because we had unencumbered funds, this would be an organization that money was flowing from the government to them to distribute. And we needed to ask ourselves, are we now going to take encumbered funds? Are we now going to accept money that, our whole philosophy at the Indigenous Peoples Resilience Fund is community knows what community needs. So our job is not to judge what they're asking for. Our job is to know that what we did is our criteria was, as long as they agreed to send us a report on what they did, and they could do that in many ways. They could do it with a video, they could do it by calling us, and we would write out the report. And we had some very grassroots people who actually asked for money and got their money. We did not have one bad report from, money overspent. As a matter of fact, we would get people calling us saying, our budget, this is what we put in our budget. I wonder if we could change it. And we said, well, actually, you can do whatever you want, because we told you this is, you know what you need. We're not there. And they said, yeah, and that just makes us more responsible. And it was a fascinating thing to go through. One thing we didn't talk about, Bruce, is, I'm going to ask you to do this because I can never remember this. In the we didn't talk about what was in that declaration, but were three activities.
Mm-hmm.
So between the three of us, do you think we could come up with that?
One was learn and remember. There are actually 7 actions which would, I'll say, translate to the 7 grandfather teachings, but we put them in 3 categories: learn and remember something, and participate and act was the last one. I can't remember what the middle one was.
I can't.
Okay.
Learning.
I have a mouse pad with it that I use all the time, and of course I look at it, but I don't see it anymore. It sits on my desk. But this was very much it was very much calling on the philanthropic community and those within our sphere to unlearn what they had learned, to learn new things, and using those learnings to act in new ways that would be in relation with Indigenous organizations, not we're going to do things to you, or here's some money, but you have to do it our way. It was very much, this is about, what you need in your community, and therefore we will support, we want to work with you in partnership and respectfully in ways that will meet the needs of your community, not meet the needs of our process.
Mm-hmm.
So one of the things when I'm, Bruce, where we're thinking about where we are today and the kinds of things we're all involved in. I'd like to start with you, Elisa, and tell us a little bit about where you are in the way of where you are today in your work, and what you would like to see happen.
Where am I? When you think, I can think, I don't know if you remember when Stephen Harper had said the apology to Indigenous peoples. I remember exactly where I was, or when the final report was delivered of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. I do remember that. And I think many Indigenous people have those markings etched in their minds. I've done a lot of learning in my life. I think I've went to school for many years. I tell my kids I've done many degrees, and decided to go to medical school about 7 years ago, and stepped away from the sector in terms of working with a number of foundations and charitable organizations across the country to write their reconciliation action plans. And a lot of that work actually asked these organizations, whatever the organization was, to just think about where they are and where they came from, and where the money that they have, that they gift and then hold attachment to, came from. And many times for many organizations, it's on the lands of Indigenous peoples or the resources of Indigenous peoples. And I share that because in going back to school 7 years ago, I went back to school to go into medicine with the intention of returning to my community to practice medicine, to practice family medicine. We all have heard that many people in Canada do not have a primary care provider, and that exists for many rural communities. And one part of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, there's a huge, I guess a large part of it is on health, right? To improve health. But it isn't so much the words as the words that are in the declaration. It's more about the outcomes that are a result of that. So we will only see, these are only words until we actually see the outcomes of health professionals who are trained to provide culturally safe care so Indigenous people don't experience systemic racism within the healthcare system. We'll only see outcomes when there are more Indigenous peoples, or not, but culturally safe healthcare. The unlearning comes in, so I've learned all the steps to be a family physician, to provide care. But when I actually think about what does it mean to actually provide holistic care, it requires even unlearning for myself as an Indigenous person providing care, because you can continue to fix broken systems, right, through medical models, or I can take a moment to step back and say, well, what does it mean to provide care that is holistic? How can I be in relation with the person who's across from me who might be experiencing many issues, but take time to build that relation? So I think when you ask where am I today, I still take a lot of those learnings from even my experiences in the sector, or just you take learnings of life with you. But you do have to take a moment to say, how do I do things differently? And it's the same, like I think in walking in this building, you probably could have just created a building with 4 walls and put canoes in there, or you could have helped build that experience, which I feel I felt walking into the doors this evening. So just to draw it back to the sector and the declaration, in returning to community, I've had to now have conversations with, in fundraising, have conversations again with some organizations. And it has changed, because I've spoken to some funders where they say, actually we have a donor advised fund, but we actually gift to Indigenous peoples to decide what to do with that now. Or, we have a strategy and we fund it for the last 10 years. So it's really interesting to return and see now, these years later, a bit of change that's happened. So
Certainly the pandemic, I'd say, changed a lot and I'm now using the foundation community in particular, changed a lot because money needed to be deployed rapidly into community, and we didn't necessarily have the infrastructure in which to do it. So a lot of foundations found vehicles at a very community grassroots level in which to give money. And I will say that the foundation community has been constrained by our tax system and Revenue Canada and how CRA governs us, that we are really supposed to give our money to registered charities in Canada. There are some workarounds. They're hard. They can be hard, but the legislation got loosened just a little bit in 2018, just in time, thankfully. Um, and I give great credit to Vicky and to her colleague Wanda, a good friend who really led the creation of the Indigenous Peoples Resilience Fund, because they were very adamant that this money that was coming out of the Resilience Fund would go to whoever needed it, whether they were a charitable organization recognized by Revenue Canada or not. And it was a complete game changer for most of us, that here we could give money and it would go directly into the hands of community where community needed it. And it created, I'd say, more brave space for the philanthropic community to say, we could probably do it too. It's not a tough workaround to, create a funding agreement as opposed to a grant agreement. It's changing a word and, having a conversation maybe twice a year instead of once a year, and getting a business receipt as opposed to a tax receipt. And you just have to educate your accountant to say, this works. So it's not hard. It's not rocket science. And what it also the pandemic really sort of created and what we and this is a lingo thing in philanthropy right now is trust-based philanthropy. I guess we didn't trust before, but now we trust. But it's really about unlocking funds and giving operating dollars to charities. So most of us fund programs, but the charity has to run somehow. But we'll give them money for the program that they're running, not to actually run the charity. And so it's one of the changes that has really accelerated as a part of COVID. Um, we've seen some foundations have actually given asset transfers. So foundations tend to sit on endowments. People have actually carved out part of their endowment and said, here, to an organization. So the Resilience Fund would be one. The Foundation for Black Communities, which came out of COVID and sort of George Floyd, a reaction to George Floyd, was another where people started saying, here is part of our assets to go so that you can deploy this into community. And I'd say the next frontier, and I'm actually working on one right now, is a land back program. So looking at land as medicine for Indigenous peoples, how do we create the conditions to buy back significant pieces of land? Most people are not donating the land; they want money for it. But how do we unlock dollars to actually buy land back for Indigenous communities so that they can use it for cultural practice, for healing, for wellness, for family reunification if they've been involved in the child welfare system. So for a variety of purposes and connecting youth back to land and to culture and ceremony.
We have one. I'm going to ask you one question, or Bruce, you can ask the question to Elisa, and then we'll take questions from the audience.
What am I asking, Elisa?
What are you asking me?
You raised this at the beginning to future kids.
Oh yeah. We sort of sketched out something, and I sort of said my question to Elisa was, you have young kids. What's your hope? You've seen some change, but as you look out 20, 25 years, as your children get, I'll say, to your age, what do you hope for them, and how do you hope that the world will be different for them?
That's a big question.
It's a really easy one, I think.
Yeah. We want the world to be here.
Yeah.
I think that's the easiest part of the question. But as an Indigenous woman, I mean, I want, as a First Nations woman, I want my children to obviously have opportunity. I want them to not face some of the challenges that I may have faced. I was at a meeting this past weekend and we were sharing our experiences of going to high school. And I remember myself going to high school and choosing my classes and the principal saying, well, no, the Native kids go in the general stream, right? And so I don't want my kids to ever experience that. And, that happened. But my girl, my oldest daughter, every day on the announcements in her current school, she does an Ojibwe word of the day, which there are opportunities or expressions and celebration of culture that that may have not been for, Victoria, even in your experience. And I think, even just seeing that one exhibit there where you're sharing the story. So I want my children to be part of the story and be part of the positive aspect of, a future Canada, a future world. So probably a very deep question there, but I always think about hope and opportunity, and I think all of us would agree that that is something that we can share.
So I think that's the end of it. I think we're going to be thrown out of here. But
It's called The Hook.
Not at